Hello and welcome. This is Paul Sims speaking to you from eyeforpharma in London. Well done for being here on time. Thank you so much. I can see a lot of you still signing in though, so don't go anywhere. I'm going to start in about 60 seconds just to let a few more people join as I can see the number going up as I speak. Speak to you in a minute. Okay, let's get going. Once again, this is Paul Sims speaking to you from eyeforpharma in London. And thank you so much for being here. This is going to be an exciting webinar. As you can hopefully see from your screen right now, it's called Let's Talk About Value. And indeed, we're going to be using real-world evidence to determine drug price and performance. So a really interesting session today. And I'm just going to say a quick word about the motivation for today's session. I mean, let's be honest, it's no secret that drug pricing pressures are mounting on a global scale. And really, there has never been a clearer and more immediate need for our industry, pharma, to demonstrate true value of therapies, and rightly so if we are to access new markets whilst achieving alignment on costs and affordability across industry, patients, and of course, our payers. So the purpose of today's webinar is really to investigate how RWE is being used to inform these questions of drug value and effectiveness. We're going to explore some best practices, we're going to explore some new ideas, we're going to explore what work has been done to date to determine the best drug prices and value using RWE, what this actually means for our evidence generation strategies, and how we can actually solve the risk-sharing equation to bring required treatments to patients who need them most at a way that is affordable and justifiable for them. So we're going to hear a little bit about assessment frameworks and perhaps even what payers are doing and how that's being assessed. We're going to be hearing about practical ways of leveraging RWE across the drug life cycle. And we're going to be even hearing about epidemiology and how using databases can challenge the traditional evidence hierarchy. Today's session is being recorded, so you don't need to ask me. You'll get a recording whether you're here live or not. Of course, I am ably joined to cover this topic by some people who you will hopefully see on your screen right now. So let me introduce them to you quickly. The first is Carolyn on your top left. Now, Carolyn represents Aetion, where she's the CEO, and I actually want to say a particular thanks to Aetion for being a partner in today's webinar. They've very much helped make sure it can happen, and been a great partner, by the way, in working with us on this. I would actually say Aetion is a company that is genuinely moving the needle in our industry, and I know that many of you already know Aetion already. In case you don't, they really specialize in bringing scientific rigor into real-world evidence, and they're actually already working with 12 of the top 20 pharma, as well as, most importantly, with the FDA and with payers. And you might have actually joined us for a previous webinar earlier this year, which was one of our most popular of all time, where we actually talked about some of the work that Aetion is doing around RCT, substitution, duplication, and some really interesting stuff that they're doing in partnership with the FDA. If you weren't aware of that, then please contact me and I may be able to dig up a recording for you. So really pleased that Carolyn can join us. She's obviously very passionate about turning real-world data into regulatory-grade evidence, really designing to work out which treatments work best for whom and when. She's also got leadership experience at 3 companies prior to joining Aetion, who really are central to this shift from volume to value. She was in charge of Remedy Partners. She was an EVP at Evolent Health, where she was actually in charge of payer strategy and operations. And she was even a leader in Medicare and Medicaid businesses at United Health previously. so it comes with experience and knowledge from both sides. Thank you, Carolyn. Under Carolyn's name is Eddie Lee, who is the head of US HEOR strategy at UCB. He's actually leading the development and execution of HEOR strategies to ensure payer-relevant and impactful real-world evidence and health economic resources support the value proposition of the UCB portfolio. He's led the National Health Outcomes Value and Access team, responsible for robust clinical and RWE engagements to enhance access for patients with severe chronic diseases. So really glad you could be here, Eddie. Thank you very much. Pam, on your top right, she's the Chief Scientific Officer at ICER, and in that capacity, she's responsible for leading the organization's research enterprise, including systematic evidence reviews, health economic modeling, and is also part of ICER's senior management team, where she's obviously working to expand the application and utility of ICER's work. She was actually part of industry as well. She was the Chief Medical Officer, where she focused on rare disease, and prior to that, she was working in academic medicine, and she was even once nominated for Physician of the Year in Houston. So great that you can be with us, Pam. Last but most certainly not least is Enkeleda. Thank you for joining us from Belgium, where you are the Senior Director and Head of RWE at Janssen EMEA. Just over a year, been leading the RWE EMEA team within Health Economics, Market Access and Reimbursement Group. And Enkeleda actually brings around 13 years of pharma experience in roles from PROs to health outcomes to market access, previously at Lilly and indeed at UCB. She actually started her career as a consumer psychologist and has worked in various projects conducting research focused on understanding human behavior. So I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me. Couldn't really ask for a better panel to focus on this topic. Now, before I hand over to Carolyn, who's going to give us a few slides, I would like you guys to look on the right-hand side of your screen where you will see a little questions box. Perhaps you could send me a little hello so that I know that you're paying attention, haven't fallen asleep already. And then I know that you know where that is. I've only got a couple so far, so come on everyone, send me a hello. You know, let me know that I'm not on my own here. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Now, obviously, that you've found this, please do use it. This is the way to make sure that you indeed get your questions answered. So do ask them. I hope that everybody can ask at least one question over the course of today's session. Right. That's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Carolyn now. So Carolyn, I'm just going to switch screens and unmute you. So there we go. Wonderful. We can see your slides now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much and welcome everybody. We are so pleased to connect today to advance this discussion we've been having globally on how data can improve our decision making related to prescription drugs. And today's focus, of course, is on using real-world evidence to assess drug pricing and performance. This is something, as Paul indicated, we are very passionate about at Aetion. We've built a tech platform that takes real-world data, transforms it into decision-grade evidence. We're working with the FDA and other regulators, with life sciences companies, payer organizations, to create transparent analyses in a systematic way. And of course, everybody on the phone today is familiar with the drug pricing trends that we're seeing. You can see from this chart here, it's not unique to just one country to have experienced increases in drug costs. And we know that the escalating costs are likely to continue given what's in the pipeline, innovative curative therapies and more exciting opportunities to support the patients that we're serving. But the big question is how to evaluate the value of these therapies. And we're here today to talk about ways in which real-world evidence can be applied to these important questions. Wanting to give just a quick context on health technology assessment agencies. Most of us on the phone today are familiar with them, but just to recap, they evaluate broad considerations to inform policy creation around pricing and coverage. And health technology in this context, it's important to understand, is inclusive of drugs, medical devices, medical products. When we think about HTAs, this is just a sampling of agencies that likely come to mind. They are globally tying price to value. And this, of course, has long been a focus in global market access. It's a growing topic within the US with value assessment frameworks that have been introduced. So, like I said, we have a sampling here. You see ICER, the Innovation and Value Initiative, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, American Society of Clinical Oncology. So there's other examples as well. And these HTA agencies have historically used RWE for cost effectiveness model input, less often for comparative effectiveness evidence. And, understandably so, because there have been some challenges. We have an evidence hierarchy as an example that prioritized randomized controls. We don't necessarily have clear guidance on acceptable methodology from evaluators. There has been a lack of transparency in how methodology has been created and how it links causation in ways in which data can be used and assessed for being fit for purpose. So we understand all of these questions that have existed historically, but also know that we've made a lot of progress. And here's just, again, a sampling of what we're seeing from different HTA agencies in recognition of the advancement of RWE methodology, the availability of real-world data, which is being captured now in a much more consistent, reliable way than it has been historically. And we know that the need to assess value has helped to shift the role of RWE in HTA evaluations and considerations. Now, they're in varying stages of planning and adoption related to real-world evidence. And you can see that NICE and CADIS, as an example, are exploring how RWE can be incorporated into their assessment processes. CADIS, in particular, is focused on how RWE can be generated throughout the drug life cycle. And ICER has also committed to generating RWE for their assessments. And all of these taken together help to demonstrate the opportunity for RWE throughout the HTA assessment process, from horizon scanning through managing the landscape and everything in between. And in order to realize the utility of real-world evidence throughout this process, we believe that principal database method epidemiology is the most effective approach, and I'll talk more about how we interpret that in just a moment. So on our platform, as an example, we've built processes to support the generation of evidence for high-stakes decision-making, and we follow this process. We think it's important to avoid black boxes, to bring a level of transparency so that studies can be replicated, so that we have the ability to assess data quality, so that we can understand data provenance. And this then will empower regulators and HTAs to audit studies, change parameters, do their own sensitivity analyses, so that they too can have confidence in the methodology that's being applied, and certainly from the insights that we can derive from real-world evidence, so that we can apply them in a more consistent way as we're making decisions. So I'll leave you with the thought that there is a tremendous opportunity for biopharma to build the infrastructure that's needed to ensure we're using data fit for the purpose of the specific questions that we're asking. And as we incorporate real-world evidence into a strategic plan related to brand and thinking about how we're managing a product through its life cycle, we will be better equipped to connect with regulators, with HTA agencies, in ensuring that they're adopting RWE in their reviews in the most responsible and credible way. So let's use this as context for our discussion now. And I'll turn it back to you, Paul, to get a sense of our audience, what they're thinking about, and then, of course, we can move into our discussion with the panelists.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think you framed that very nicely. And thank you to those of you who've already sent in a few questions. We'll get to those, so do keep them coming in. Really, a very positive and opportunistic approach, I think, that we can all display now with RWE. But I think I'd like to just start by asking the audience, what's stopping us? We've heard some really encouraging reasons why we need to take part in this, but what is actually stopping us? So if you look at your screen right now, you'll see a question appear. Are you or will you soon use RWE as a tool for enabling new types of value or outcomes-based assessment within your own firm? So this will give us a really good idea of where everybody is right now. So you can choose. You've only got one choice, I'm afraid. Yes, this is becoming a universal and necessary standard across all of your treatment areas, across all of your drugs, no matter what. Yes, but primarily for specialty or high-price treatment, so you're much more selective about how and where RWE is actually being used. You're unsure, you've got some major variability around the company, perhaps depending on whether or not there's an individual involved who is pioneering this within your firm. We intend to, but the reality is you've not got far yet. You're not really implementing as yet. Or finally, we are not yet convinced. We're at the non-existent, or we're still piloting and experimenting. So I'll hold that open another 3 seconds. Roughly half of you have voted. So 3, 2, 1. Let's get those votes in. Thank you very much. Okay, let's have a look at the results. Okay, so I think we can look on this positively. Obviously, I think we have a positive group listening to this session, but over a third of you saying that it's becoming a universal and necessary standard in your work, and a quarter of you roughly on the others. Only 2% saying not yet convinced. I suppose you might be feeling like you're in the wrong room if that's you. So so hopefully positivity. I'll come to the panel shortly for comments, but actually what I'm going to do is move straight on to another question, because I want to just see what's actually stopping us. So have a look at this one. What are the greatest barriers towards increased in investment and adoption of RWE in your company? This is really across the board, quite a general question. Is it a limited awareness of the potential of RWE, or an entrenched mindset that perhaps it doesn't need to be any different from how it used to be? Is there a lack of senior level buy-in, executive support, or indeed you haven't got the financial support that you need in terms of budget limits? Is it a lack of know-how, capabilities, existing resources? You don't have who you need within the organization. You don't have the tools you need. Is it a lack of data sources and analytic solutions to provide the evidence? You can't get hold of the information or the findings that you're looking for? Or finally, is it an external reason? Is it because of the local regulators or HTAs that you are experiencing in your own geographic responsible markets? So I can see, again, roughly half of you have voted. The alert half, come on, other half, need you to take part. 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much. Let's have a look at those results. So once again, I know I was difficult in making you only choose one, but there's a winner on this one. It's actually a lack of the data sources and analytic solutions. More than a third of you choosing that one, with roughly even results, much lower for all of the rest. Okay, so that's very interesting. I would love to invite our panel now to comment on those things. Let me just say that the panel are going to be speaking from their own personal point of view, not necessarily representing their companies today. So panelists, any comments on what you've seen? Any comments on what Carolyn said? Who wants to go first? Oh, I've just realized that I've kept you all on mute, so that's why it's silent. Okay, so it would be smart for me to unmute everybody. Unmute everybody, yes. Okay. Oh, it didn't actually work. I'll have to do it all manually. For some reason, it's not letting me unmute you. Why is that? Excuse me, everybody. Okay. Oh, there we go. It's working now. Lovely. Okay. So, panel, who wants to contribute?
Hi, Paul. It's Eddie.
Hey, Eddie, go for it.
Hi. I think I could take a stab at the first polling question. So, I believe that real-world evidence is not only a tactic or tool, but a broader strategy of increasing relevance, especially in the movement from efficacy to effectiveness, and ultimately a way to translate the value of that effectiveness seen in the real world. In similar fashion, we've challenged ourselves with making it easier to translate traditional outcomes research studies into feasible concept studies that are probably a little bit more conducive for value-based agreements. So we acknowledge that robust studies with clearly defined selection criteria and varying levels of complexity in the methods, to address issues with bias and confounders are needed, especially when we consider publications and in a way to proactively disseminate the study's findings to our external stakeholders. But often in the context of value-based agreements, simpler is better, and often involves exercises of peeling away the complex layers of traditional studies to an analytical approach that is viewed more favorably in terms of resource requirements and feasibility. And not to mention that it's iterative in nature, and this process requires multiple revisions, often in a short period of time, in parallel with peer discussions. So we plan our RWE, and Carolyn mentioned this, that it's fit for purpose, and continually leverage our insights as it's critical to help us assess the risk of value-based agreements being considered. So it's definitely universal. It's definitely a standard. We engage from early pipeline through our lifecycle management, and we continue to try to push the bar in terms of leveraging RWE for the insight that's needed to convince our external decision makers of the value that we bring.
Thank you. Who else?
Yes. Hi, Paul. This is Leda. Sticking with this first question, seeing that feedback from everyone, I think the use of real-world evidence is expanding throughout the product life cycle. It is true that when it comes to outcome-based agreements, is in an area that is still evolving, and it doesn't surprise me that still a quarter are saying that it is left for high-priced treatments or specialty treatments, because it is true that it does reflect the reality. Very often we see nowadays more and more innovative treatments where real-world evidence has a particularly important role to play in certain disease areas where it's even complicated to conduct clinical trials. And then with the progress in technology and the solutions that we are providing to our patients with innovative treatments that we're basically curing patients, like CAR T therapies or gene therapies, this is type of an evolving area that outcome-based agreements will be very important and relevant. We have already seen how this space is rapidly growing. It is a bit more complex when it comes to more standard treatments to move fastly and swiftly into outcome-based agreements because of the various reasons that we'll discuss today. So it doesn't surprise me, these findings, that there is still a strong focus as well on more innovative and high-priced treatments.
Great. Can I ask?
Paul?
Sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry. Paul, I was just going to respond to the second question. This is Pam. I think that it's difficult sometimes for companies to make that internal shift where they consider how important it is to allocate resources for accessing data and accessing analytics to prepare their portfolio for all the assessments that have to take place after regulatory approval. And I think that there's still a cultural shift that has happened in a few places, but not across the board. And I do perceive that there is some that there are leaders who are not yet convinced that these are absolutely critical activities for their organizations.
Right. So we're getting there, but it's a relatively measured adoption is what you're all telling me. But I want to try and focus a little bit on the topic that we said from the outset, which is using RWE to determine drug price and performance. Can we talk for a moment on whether or not our RWE is being used to determine prices, whether internally or externally, and whether or not, and how the evolution of that is likely to go forward, what you and your organizations are trying to do to bring that forward, if indeed it is what you're planning to do. Maybe you could talk for a moment on that. Who wants to talk about that for a moment? Silence. Come on, panel. You're here for a reason. Let's focus on getting ourselves not, so that we're using RWE for beyond providing evidence at the launch stage, but indeed to actually determine how much value we're providing. And let's talk about that for a moment, shall we?
Yeah, so we're probably more proactive about, incorporating and leveraging real-world evidence for our internal value assessment process. So, when we think about the value of a pipeline product or the value of adding new indications, along with the clinical trial data, we make sure to include real-world evidence, whether it's from an epidemiology perspective, continuing to understand what are the unmet needs, how can UCB bring a new solution to this patient population that continues to have uncontrolled disease. I think where we struggle a little bit is then how do we also incorporate our RWE evidence and incorporate our strategy into external value assessment frameworks for that pricing process. So, I think the value assessment groups have all made progress, considering more formal and standardized incorporation of RWE into this value assessment process. But I still think that there's room for improvement of what that dialogue looks like, but also more consistency as to how, pharma sponsored and pharma generated RWE can be more aligned with the expectations of the external value assessment process.
Mm-hmm. A question from the audience is about ROI and what factors would a board expect from investing in RWE, and whether or not, of course, those factors are increasing in number and our expectations are going up. So, Eddie, or indeed, I think Enkeleda, you're about to speak. So tell me about that as well.
No, I was just going to say, to build on at this point, that I fully agree, Janssen, we're in the similar journey, using in a similar way real-world evidence. We have been using, as I think most of the pharma companies, is more sporadic, let's say, the use of outcome-based agreements, and is judged on a one-by-one basis. I actually even remember back at the time when I was working UCB several years ago, using actually with NICE outcome-based agreements with them specifically, or when, joining Janssen now, I've seen examples in countries in Europe being used, but it is true that it remains on a one-to-one basis, seen based on the complexity of the drug that we're talking about. In general, my experience working in different companies has been that the willingness of peers or HTA agencies, it's not at the highest levels either, so it is an evolving space. And I think the challenges of the data that was listed a bit earlier in the second question is also something that is still that we are trying to get better in terms of the data capture. But there is progress being made slowly by all stakeholders.
And Paula, I can comment about what we're seeing broadly across our client base. And we certainly are seeing increasing adoption, and just to build on Enkeleda and Eddie's points, that we are also seeing a receptivity in certain areas and then trepidation in others in terms of how to apply. And I think as an industry, we can identify areas where it's a no-brainer to apply real-world evidence because we collect data in a consistent and reliable way, as an example, or because, for a cardiovascular outcomes trial, as an example, in the safety context, or, there's many other examples for label expansions and other use cases where it can be a no-brainer, if you will, to use RWE. It's reliable, the studies are replicable, And that's where we can focus on getting traction. And then there are other areas where maybe we're not capturing data in a reliable and consistent way, or we're not accessing that data systematically, where maybe those are places where that's where we should focus in the future, or consider, maybe in parallel, but not to slow down the progress in the areas where we know we can make traction and where it is acceptable today. And that's where we're seeing our clients start to embrace RWE most holistically.
Okay. Now, Carolyn, obviously you are, as a company, trying to expand the use of RWE and the use of the utility of RWE. And I already mentioned the last webinar where we talked about a lot of that. Do you think that pharma companies could be more proactive? There could be more co-creation, co-working with regulators in the same way that you're doing? And is there anything that people can actually do proactively? Because it seems to me that people are somewhat passive in what they can do, somewhat beholden to what the external environment is enabling. So can we be more proactive?
We can always be more proactive, Paul. I would say that we do see a fair amount of variability in terms of the investment and readiness that our clients are making. So there are clients, as an example, that have fully embraced RWE, are thinking about ways to integrate it across the product life cycle, and actually are actively engaging with regulators, with HTA agencies, on thinking about ways in which to apply it. There are already submissions, as an example, of RWE, some of which are accepted. So we have the Ibrance example from Pfizer's with male breast cancer, and then others where it hasn't been. And each of these opportunities gives us insight into what regulators and evaluators are thinking about and what hurdles become necessary for them. We, of course, are also at Aetion engaged in the Duplicate Initiative with the FDA, where we're evaluating 37 clinical trials to see the extent to which data could be used to supplement the trials, or maybe even in lieu of trials, to come to the same conclusion more quickly and as reliably. And we see that our clients are oftentimes engaging in trial-like exercises using data for drugs that they have in their pipeline, for drugs that are already on the market. So they're enhancing their understanding. And then, of course, as you've indicated, there are others that are more at the beginning phases of that. But I don't think it's right to just sort of blanket say we're not seeing that level of proactivity or engagement, because we certainly are. And I would, build on Encoleta's point that what we need to do is demonstrate where there are data that are fit for purpose and how the analytical tools can be applied in a consistent way so that there's credibility with those findings and there's confidence that in going down this path, it will yield positive results.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm going to read out a few audience questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to read out a few, and please feel free to take those that you are most able to. So Andrew says, what do you think about data completeness and its importance to regulators? How much of a factor is that in decision making? Benoit makes a comment, says it's at the moment far too complex to have a global approach and standards when HTA bodies work at local level. I'm going to be talking about that a little later in this webinar. David says, while the FDA and second in line the EMA are moving forward on RWE, is its use by HTAs and payers, at least in Europe, widely overestimated, at least in regard to treatment effects? The publications by McCarty et al. And the London School of Economics, as well as NICE's own report by the Decision Support Unit, are sobering. Thank you. So not sure if anyone has any comments on that. Could we ask the panel about methodology around RWE? Is there a clear and precise guideline that we could need to follow for building strong studies? Well, I think that's we could probably run an entire webinar just on that. In fact, we could run a whole day on that. Can you address the scenario when you have a treatment for a rare disease when inelastic demand and the friction between the internal needs to set price in a way that generates revenue to sustain operations of the company versus actual financial value to the healthcare market? Sorry, that one's quite a mouthful. Not sure if anyone followed that or not, but any responses to those questions?
Hi, this is Sankileda. I just want to build on that point around the complexity of the data, which I fully agree. I think having worked in the real-world evidence space for a while, I think, well, data is king. So, and I think if you start, and I mean, we always talk about the complexity, and actually even when it comes to the reputation, if you will, of real-world evidence, is a bit the bottleneck often. And then linked with the importance of having the right data is actually the methods that we use. I'm always very impressed that we have, for example, in pharmaceutical companies, we have big R&D departments, and then real-world evidence, which I think should have as much weight, quite honestly, and then it is growing that weight between the investment that we make in randomized clinical trials versus real-world evidence. But the complexity of conducting real-world evidence studies is actually even more complex than doing the randomized clinical trials, which are actually experiments, and we control very closely everything. So I think the importance of focusing a lot on continuing building the data platforms, and in Europe is particularly complicated actually because of the diversity of each country, but also the importance of focusing on the methods and using the right methodology and building the right real-world evidence teams with the right strong scientific background with epidemiologists and data scientists, because these are things that will help us shifting further that the pain point that we have on the acceptability of real-world evidence as a robust method to be accepted by our external customers.
And Paul, this is Pam. I'd like to build on that, specifically on rare disease. I think that rare disease is very challenging. Having been on the industry side of that as well, it's very challenging. And I think that companies sometimes go into rare disease space without fully understanding the challenges around regulatory approval and HTA approval for products that are focused on rare disease. And I think that part of the difficulty is understanding that there are HTA bodies around the world who don't necessarily understand all those limitations as well. And so they're challenged with sometimes very limited data and very high prices. And those are very difficult decisions to make. So I think that there is an evolution that has to happen. And I would say that the more engaged and the more aware that companies are who are in that space around those challenges, the better prepared that they'll be to put together successful portfolios.
Okay, thank you, Pam. And just staying with you for one more second, can we get some suggestions from you in terms of, you obviously have that industry experience, but you now have a very different role, and indeed where you actually believe companies should be investing further from your point of view, and whether or not you think the needle is going to be moved as a result of those things, particularly in terms of making prices more affordable. Can you give us some comments on that, please?
Yes, so I think that one of the biggest challenges is, again, many times executive decision makers in companies understand the regulatory approval process and they understand efficacy, but they don't understand in a very concrete way cost effectiveness. And unless they are generating evidence and including high quality evidence in their submissions to support cost effectiveness, they're not going to be successful at an HTA level. And so I think that the degree to which they can fill evidence gaps that are really required in order to understand the true cost effectiveness of the product, the degree to which they can do that is the degree to which they will be successful in their applications. But if they think that the data that they used for regulatory approval will be sufficient to demonstrate cost effectiveness, then they're going to be disappointed in the result from submission to payers.
Thank you. And can you, that's great. Can you give us any more nuance in where you think that within the cost effectiveness package that anything needs to be really improved upon? So where is the specific deficit at the moment, would you say?
Yeah, so a payer perspective is on a much longer horizon, most of the time, than a data package for regulatory approval. So most clinical trials end in a short amount of time, 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years, which is a bit unusual. But a payer is looking at its investment portfolio over the lifetime of the patient. And there's a real big gap between demonstrating short-term efficacy and demonstrating long-term effectiveness and long-term safety. Those two things, long-term effectiveness and long-term safety, are the major drivers of costs for payers. And unless a company can demonstrate that with data, including with real-world data, they're going to have a difficult time getting the price that they're wanting. When they're doing their internal models, they're assuming that short-term efficacy translates into long-term effectiveness and into long-term safety, but a payer will not make that assumption. And that's the biggest gap that I see.
So back to our panel, how can we use real-world evidence to provide that long-term evidence base? Is it indeed feasible, and are there any techniques or tricks that we know to make sure that that becomes feasible?
Well, I'll start and then look to Eddie and others to weigh in on how they're applying it. I think that's great context, Pam. And this also gets to the question on methodology that one of the audience members asked. And I think that's where it's important to be explicit up front about the question that we're answering, the hypothesis that we're testing, the study criteria we're applying, and the statistical methodology that we're using to come up with a result. And then certainly we've talked about data and whether it's fit for purpose. So ensuring that we're evaluating the data sources and the quality. We understand where the data has come from, how consistently it's been captured, and we're very transparent about sharing that so that when it comes to the evaluation phase, we can demonstrate how reliable it is for that long-term view that Pam was just referencing. And as we're implementing analyses, thinking about the feasibility, sensitivity analyses, taking this iterative approach so that we can be robust at understanding effectiveness and safety. Using data, of course, when drugs are already on the market, we can follow patients across countries, across numbers of years, and looking at different combinations of chronic illnesses as an example that they might be facing. So we can start to test variability in the patient populations longer term that I think help us to address the concerns Pam raised about that long-term effectiveness and safety considerations, but applying that methodology in a transparent way so that it can be replicated and ensuring that we're capturing the data and making the case for when it's fit for purpose are absolutely critical to making a credible case.
Eddie and Kaleda, anything else to add? Or has Carolyn covered it perfectly?
No, I fully agree. Eddie, go ahead.
Good.
Yeah, and it's been challenging. If we think about some of the more recent cost-effectiveness analysis reports that have become available to kind of the U.S. payer audience, we're looking at 10-year time horizons or lifetime horizons, and while it's meaningful to help explain the overall cost that's consumed when a patient is starting therapy A versus therapy B, What's challenging is that sometimes the benefits of specific therapies for chronic diseases aren't realized until the later years. So, if we still think about, payers thinking on an annual basis, at least in the US, thinking about retaining their members on average 3-4 year time period, it has been a challenge to then, translate the benefits or the price based on cost effectiveness based on a 10-year or lifetime horizon to a more short-term budget impact of what the implications are over a 1, 2, or 3 year time frame. However, though, it has afforded us with the opportunity to be more proactive in engaging payers with discussions around cost effectiveness analysis, which has oftentimes transpired into additional RWE initiatives that is either insight from the payer that can inform our RWE strategy for subsequent years, but also has opened the door more for a co-creation of RWE research questions that allows us to better understand from the payer's perspective, how do they view this population? How are they managing this population? Is there a way for newer therapies to be more cost effective based on who they make it available to when they allow it to be used? So, while we have our challenges, that dialogue has helped us tremendously in better understanding from the payer's perspective of how they intend to apply some of these findings from cost effectiveness analyses, but also for us to bring new analytics, which can open the doors for additional discussions around value-based agreements when appropriate.
Great, thank you.
This is Enkeleda. Unless you have something, just briefly, then I completely agree with this point about the importance of methodology, transparency, and the very important one on defining the right research questions. Where I think it's particularly getting complicated is how we're going to use real evidence by using different methods that are growing by the day, like using artificial intelligence and machine learning solutions, or even the use of social media or digital solutions, which is the borderline of how, it's a different way of collecting the data. So I think this is our true and longer term challenge. We're still trying to figure out how to do the research in terms of the more traditional approach, but I think these new ways of generating the data, I think, are going to be more complex. And I think for all stakeholders involved, whether it is pharmaceutical industry or payers and regulators, they are also thinking of how to integrate this into the decision making.
Okay. So really interesting perspectives from our panel. I'm going to ask our audience now. We've not got very much longer left of this session. So if you look at your screen, we've talked about this variability. That's where this current thread really came from. So let's hear what you guys think, and let's get some sense of where people across the board are actually placing their investments. So currently payers and HTA display variability in how and whether they consider RWE in an evidence package. What should Pharma, our primary action, be? 1, limit our investment to countries where RWE is essential. So take a very ballsy approach there. Do we invest anyway? Data is vital. We'll always include it. We need to be gathering now. Let's have a broad brush approach to data gathering. Should we encourage? Should we actually be campaigning, working with regulators and HTAs, supporting them to standardize, to adopt, and to indeed ensure that that variability is not quite as high? Do we need to find and co-create new RWE initiatives, just like how Carolyn was describing, with HTAs, payers, and indeed regulators? Or perhaps something else that I've not written on my list. Perhaps you do nothing. Perhaps you take a more pragmatic approach. So let's have a look at what the audience thinks. I'm going to hold that open another 3 seconds. Yet again, we've got 50% of people voted. So come on, everyone. 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much. Let's have a look at the results. Okay. Interesting. Very small number of people on both ends of this, limiting our investment to countries where RWE is essential. 14% of people obviously just saying let's do it anyway, but up to 3/5 of people saying that they're going to co-create new RWEs just with HCAs and payers. So a very pioneering attitude, a very proactive attitude. And indeed, I feel energized by that response, and I hope it is indeed true. So indeed, there is effort, as Carolyn said earlier. There is effort definitely going on. Any comments from our panel on this? I personally am surprised by it.
Thank you. I just would like to briefly say that I think HTA and payers are some of our end users and customers, if you own in the pharma industry, but I think we shouldn't forget of the other, like the regulators, the patients, the healthcare providers, and I think the same way we've done with the randomized clinical trials, where we have tried to bring everyone around the table to design them better, and particularly the patient having the voice of the patient in designing our clinical trials. I think it's important that we keep the whole spectrum of our end users in mind when we are co-creating our real-world evidence solutions.
And does that involve actually involving the patient sometimes in co-creation, in designing studies?
Well, that's a bit difficult to randomize clinical trials, because if you start creating something like you're doing a clinical trial, obviously there's no more real-world evidence. I find real-world evidence in itself, by definition, is quite patient-centric, because we simply collect the patient's experience. So, and I've been in multiple conferences when patients are really very vocal that even in real-world evidence solutions, to work with them. So it's a different type of involvement to randomized clinical trials, but yes, it's important to keep that patient centricity in mind.
Well, I would certainly argue that we can generate more and better data if we do so in conjunction with the patient. I'm sure you would too. Anyway, what about the results? What about any comments on the results?
Paul, just to build on that comment around keeping patients at the center, there is more that we can do on the kind of data that we capture to reflect the patient experience and also to capture what the patients care most about. So one of the challenges that we have is that we talk about outcomes, and outcomes are what we capture in claims, as an example. Well, outcomes that matter most to a patient might not be captured in claims. So one of the things that we're working on with our clients is thinking through what kinds of data are most reflective of patient goals, and how do we ensure that activities of daily living, as an example, are taken into account in ways that maybe we haven't done historically. So I would agree with Ankelita that there are many more ways that we can embrace the patient view in how we're creating real-world evidence, and then certainly how we're applying it.
Okay. I'm not going to disagree with you, but I'd love some comment on the responses here.
Yeah, so I'm happy to see the results. I think co-creation is always ideal when it's possible. And, I don't think it's lost on this audience that there's a fair amount of variability as to when and how RWE is used as a part of the decision-making process. And, the question is, how often is it being used at all? If there is an opportunity to create standardization or develop a framework for how and when RWE gets incorporated into health technology assessment or value assessment frameworks, I think it's a great opportunity that we would welcome and leverage those learnings to better refine our HUR strategy, just to align that the right research questions are being explored and executed in accordance with agreed upon standards. But even starting the dialogue with HTA payers, I think will take us a long way to see maybe utility of RWE a little bit sooner, kind of going back to this impact question. Just as an example, like discussions with payers on data requirements for value-based agreements, where payers and pharma have an opportunity to co-create concepts for value-based agreements, which allows us to better understand what is the status quo, are we defining the status quo the same way, but more importantly, understanding the real-world evidence that's required to make some of these new innovative agreements viable.
And Paul, I'd like to add a last point to this, that I think we're still, when we're co-creating, we're consulting with payers and the HTA bodies for designing our clinical development plans. I wish we'll evolve to a format where we're going to talk more broadly about evidence generation. And then it happens that sometimes those can be randomized clinical trials, and sometimes can be real-world evidence, but having a greater discussion about the broader evidence generation spectrum, I think that would really help in enabling us to co-create better. Because it is true that when we go for early advice with payers and regulators and HTA bodies in general, is a lot focused on clinical development plans and not really on real-world evidence.
A lot of people on the Q&A actually asking whether or not it's possible to create a common platform to synchronize methodologies and types of evidence, and whether or not that indeed is something that we should be doing perhaps on a collective basis rather than on an individual basis. Interested in any comments around that. We've only got 4 minutes left, so what I'm actually going to do is whilst our panel might have any comment on that, I'm going to throw up another question on the screen, which you can perhaps answer in the background. Which purpose do you consider to be the greatest driver of investment in RWE over the next 3 years? So looking forwards. So do we have any comment from, or any final words from the panel, indeed, on what they would recommend as a practical next step following this discussion, whether or not this idea of a more common platform is indeed possible, and any other advice that you can give?
I'll comment on the common platform question. We are very engaged globally with regulators and HTAs, in addition to pharma companies and payers, on the question of creating a more consistent way to evaluate data, to create evidence that we find to be credible in a systematic way to inform decisions. And we're finding that there are ways to find common ground. And if we start to align on things like transparency, replicability, scalability, the opportunity to perform sensitivity analyses and the like to test the credibility of evidence that's been submitted, that we'll start to advance a more common way to evaluate RWE and to use it more consistently. So whether that means there's a common platform globally, or whether there's more agreement on the methodology, and then those platforms that can apply that methodology in the most consistent, transparent way start to bubble up, we'll see how that evolves. But we absolutely believe and are seeing traction in the opportunity to create common ways of looking at the data and creating this evidence.
And just so you know, Carolyn, you've clearly got a few fans on the line, as people are writing in saying Aetion indeed is building the platform and is the answer to that. So it seems that you've got some supporters in the room. That's good. Any other comments from others before we finish?
Hi, this is Pam. I would just say that I'd like to add on to that and just say that there are standard questions that different stakeholders will have in addition to questions about efficacy. And those questions will drive the methodology. They're predictable questions, and the methodologies already exist to answer those questions. And so I think it's really a matter of listing out the predictable questions that will be asked and following the standard methods to answer those questions and being transparent in the process. I think those basic elements will take everybody really quite a long ways forward.
Thank you. I'm going to just close that poll and share it with you whilst we hear any final comments from Eddie or Enkeleda.
I just want to remind everyone of the IMI Get Real platform, where it's actually very nice decision trees, and it's a lot of valuable information about use, for example, of pragmatic studies. So for those of you who are interested, IMI Get Real, it's really a very interesting platform.
Mm-hmm. Eddie, anything final from you?
No, I mean, the only thing that I would add is, I think the value equation is always changing, and it's going to continue to evolve. It'll change with perspective. It'll change with new evidence that becomes available. So, I would just encourage, as, us from the pharma side, as we work with HTAs and payers and value assessment framework developers, that we're cognizant that, at the end of the day, we're moving towards price and value-based price. But value is very sensitive to whether we're thinking about it from the payer's perspective versus the patient's perspective or societal perspective. So I would just encourage us that, not only are we working with stakeholders externally, that we also have internal stakeholders. I think the design of RCTs is a big one of, is there a way to leverage RWE to optimize the endpoints or outcomes that we choose for our clinical studies to allow for better translation into the effectiveness that we would see in the real world?
Thank you, and some wise final words from each of you. You can see the results of that poll, 42% unsurprising winner at the top, but perhaps surprising how high some of the other items are on this list. A quarter of you in one case there choosing another response. So very interesting. Thank you so much to our panel. A reminder of who they are. So Carolyn, Pam, Eddie, and Enkeleda, really appreciate the time that you've given us today. I very much looking forward to working with you all in the future and advancing this conversation. Sorry if you asked a question in the last few minutes that we didn't quite get time to, but great to see great audience engagement. When I close the webinar, I'm going to hold it actually open after I finish talking for a couple of minutes. I'd love you to send in any ideas, suggestions we have for the future, any comments on what you've heard, any confessions of undying love, whatever you like, throw it all in, and we'd be glad to receive your thoughts for the future. Of course, if you want to hear more about this conversation, then I would encourage you, if you look at your screen now, to come and join us at one of our events in 2020. We've got Barcelona and Philadelphia. Barcelona is at the very end of March. Philadelphia is in the middle of April. And as you can see, there are some more good people already committed to taking part in those meetings, including Sarah from ISA there, and indeed some great people from other pharma companies part of that discussion. So if you've enjoyed today, then please do talk to us more and let's figure this out for the benefit of our industry and, of course, for patients. Once again, huge thanks, especially to Aetion for being our partner today, making sure it happened and delivering a really successful number of signups, nearly 1,000 people, I believe. So well done there, and good luck in putting this forward, and absolutely keen to hear your stories of success in the future. Have a great day, and we'll be back with you soon. Thank you.